There are places built not for the living but for the silence of eternity. Tombs hidden under mountains of stone, sealed behind walls of iron, locked beneath chains so heavy that time itself seems reluctant to disturb them. These are not monuments meant for remembrance. They are prisons of the dead, barriers between our world and something we were never meant to witness. Across deserts scorched by the sun, jungles that swallow stone, and caverns where the air tastes of dust and fear, lie structures carved with warnings. Symbols etched into the rock. Skulls, serpents, eyes that never close. Ancient civilizations didn't simply bury their kings or warriors. They built cages for secrets too dangerous to linger in daylight. Secrets that demanded silence, darkness, and eternal confinement. But here is the question that claws at the edges of history. Why would entire empires labor for decades to hide their dead from the gaze of mankind? Why the chains, the curses, the walls layered one after another? What knowledge, what object, what spirit could they have feared so much that they swore no hand must ever pry these doors open? And yet, hands always reach. Centuries after the last stone was laid, explorers, grave robbers, and even governments have stood before these doors, staring into the void of the forbidden. Some struck their hammers against the locks. Others listened to the warnings, voices carried across generations, whispers etched into scripture. Never open. But tell me, what would you do if you stood before such a door? Imagine the air thick with the stench of age, the walls trembling with a silence older than language itself. A single push and the seal might crack. A single breath, and you may inhale the dust of something that has waited, patient and restless, for centuries. Would you dare to break the silence? Would you risk discovering what generations before you swore to keep buried? Tonight we descend into those shadows. Tombs that remain closed not because they were forgotten, but because they were deliberately locked away. These are the places where myth and history overlap, where fear becomes brick and mortar. From the cursed chambers of forgotten kings to crypts bound by iron chains and rivers of salt, we will uncover the forbidden tombs that were sealed forever. But remember this, some doors were not meant to open. Some stories were never meant to be told. And by the end of this journey, you may find yourself wondering whether knowing is worth the price of awakening what sleeps in silence. So I ask you, not as a storyteller but as a witness. When faced with the threshold of the forbidden, do you look away, or do you reach for the chains? Deep in the desert of an empire that no longer exists lies a stretch of land so barren, even vultures avoid circling overhead. At its center sits a mound of stone and dust, almost shapeless, yet unmistakably man-made. Local tribes call it the tomb that screams in silence. They say it was built not as a monument to honor the dead, but as a lock to keep something from waking. The entrance has no carvings of kings, no triumphs in war, no offerings for the afterlife. Instead, jagged slabs of blackened stone rise like broken teeth, bound together with ancient copper clamps. And across the doorway, carved deep into the rock, are words so eroded that scholars argue endlessly about their meaning. The closest translation, "Do not listen." But what does that mean? What sound were they trying to protect us from? Travelers who strayed too close to the site claim that at night, when the desert wind dies down, the tomb breathes. Not loudly, not violently, just a low, steady exhalation like a sleeper beneath layers of earth. Some insist they've heard faint cries woven into the breath, as if hundreds of voices whisper in unison, begging for release. Others swear it's not a plea but a warning. Archaeologists in the 1930s attempted to break through the entrance. The journals describe hammers cracking stone, men straining against rusted clamps. They worked for 3 days. On the fourth, 2 workers were found dead in their tents, their faces frozen in expressions of terror so extreme that even the expedition's physician refused to sketch them for record. By the 5th day, the team abandoned the dig entirely, leaving behind their tools and notes. The site has been untouched ever since. But here is where the mystery deepens. Satellite imagery decades later revealed that beneath the tomb is not a single chamber but a labyrinth that descends in sharp spirals, deeper and deeper, like a staircase meant not for humans but for something vast. A descent into a place that was not designed to be revisited. What did they bury there? Was it a king who demanded silence and death? A heretic whose name was erased from every stone record? Or was it never meant for a human body at all? The tribes around the region tell a darker story, that once, long ago, a sound unlike any storm rose from the desert, a sound so loud that cattle broke their necks trying to flee, and infants went still in their mother's arms. The rulers of the time, desperate, built this tomb as a prison, sealing away not flesh and bone but the very echo of that sound. The scar across the desert still remains. Step inside the perimeter, they say, and you feel the vibration through your ribs, though the air is perfectly still. Step too close to the door, and the silence becomes unbearable, so heavy it presses against your eardrums until panic sets in. And if you linger long enough, you might hear it, a faint moan or maybe just your mind tearing under the weight of silence. Imagine being the first to break those copper seals. Imagine the creak of the clamps snapping after centuries. Would the sound be nothing more than air rushing out? Or would the silence end in a scream so old, so hungry, that it has waited lifetimes just for a listener? And here is the question the desert itself seems to whisper. If the tomb was never meant to be opened, what price will be paid if someone dares to try? High in the shadowed ranges of Eastern Europe, there rises a mountain that the locals will not name after sundown. To them, it is not a peak of beauty or adventure, but a place where the air itself is cursed. Its slopes are littered with fractured boulders, trees bent as though they tried to crawl away, and caves that swallow sound like bottomless throats. At the heart of this mountain lies a tomb so well hidden, most outsiders dismiss it as folklore. But those who live in its shadow whisper otherwise. They call it the tomb beneath the forbidden mountain. The tale begins with miners centuries ago, men who struck the mountain for silver veins. They tunneled deep, carving shafts by torchlight, until their picks hit a wall not of stone but of carved marble. Imagine their surprise. Buried hundreds of feet underground, a door smooth and cold, veined with greenish cracks like frozen veins beneath skin. No inscriptions. No royal sigils. Only one thing, an iron wheel fused shut, that no man could turn. Those miners returned with priests, convinced they had unearthed the resting place of a saint. But when they camped inside the shaft, strange things began. Lantern flames bent sideways though no wind stirred. Tools left against the wall reappeared on the ceiling beams. At night, the miners woke screaming, their throats raw, though none could remember what they had dreamed. Then came the sound. Not a scream, not a whisper, something in between. It seeped from the marble wall, like breath pushed through 100 clenched jaws. Terrified, the miners sealed the shaft themselves and swore an oath never to speak of what they had found. But oaths crumble with time. In the late 1800s, an Austrian expedition attempted to rediscover the tomb. They dug where the legends placed it and indeed uncovered the marble door. This time with dynamite they shattered the fused wheel. What they found behind it was a spiral passage plunging downward, each step carved from obsidian, each wall lined with tiny niches holding what looked like earthen jars sealed with wax. One of the explorers, a physician named Dr. Ruggin, wrote in his diary, "The air has no weight here, no life. My ears feel empty as if my skull has been hollowed. And yet, I hear the jars singing, a vibration too low for the others to notice." The deeper they went, the colder it grew until their breath turned to mist. At the lowest chamber stood a sarcophagus of black stone, bound in chains so rusted they looked like veins of dried blood. No script, no decoration, only a depression in the lid shaped perfectly for a human hand. That night, only 3 of the team returned to camp. The others were found later, scattered along the stairwell, eyes wide open but lifeless, their ears bleeding. The survivors refused to explain. Dr. Ruggin burned his diary in the fire, muttering only one phrase over and over, "It should not be heard." After this, the villagers resealed the mountain with rock slides, collapsing the shaft forever. To this day, no one dares attempt to dig again. But the question remains, what was sealed in that sarcophagus and why the jars? Were they meant as guardians? Or vessels trapping voices too dangerous to release? Legends tell of a figure, a priest who defied the church, accused of summoning angels not from heaven, but from the void between stars. They say his body was buried in chains, for his tongue carried words not meant for mankind. Perhaps the jars held fragments of those words, bottled whispers of forbidden prayer. Perhaps the sarcophagus holds not a corpse but a voice, bound and waiting. And here's the most chilling part. Mountaineers still report strange echoes when storms roll across the peak. Not thunder, not wind. Something layered within it, a resonance like a human choir buried deep in stone. They say if you listen too closely, you don't just hear them. In the desert heart of Mesopotamia, there is a patch of land where no shadow lasts. Travelers crossing it say the air shimmers as if set ablaze, though no fire can be seen. Locals call it the Scorched Hollow, and at its center lies a burial mound unlike any other. A tomb that smolders without smoke, glows without fire, and has remained sealed since the first kings laid claim to the cradle of civilization. The legend begins with a forgotten city-state, swallowed by shifting sands nearly 3,000 years ago. Its rulers practiced rites so unholy that even their enemies refused to speak of them. When the last of its kings died, the priests built him a chamber of limestone deep beneath the desert floor. But before the lid was lowered, witnesses swore the body burst into flame though no torch touched it, and yet his flesh did not char. The fire danced across his skin like water across glass. Terrified, the priests covered him in layers of ash, salt, and bitumen. Still, the body glowed as if a furnace roared beneath the stone. Finally, they carved protective symbols into the walls, chained the sarcophagus shut, and sealed the tomb with molten lead. And still, the heat rose. So they buried the entire chamber under mounds of sand and left it to the desert. Centuries later, during the height of colonial excavations, explorers claimed to rediscover the site. Among them was Sir Howard Dane, a man obsessed with cursed burials. His journal survives in fragments, though most of it was burned before he died. In one surviving page, he describes descending into a shaft that wept with heat, though the air was still. There was no torch, no ember, he wrote, yet the stone glowed red as if alive. My men's clothes smoked though no fire touched them. I felt the flame inside my lungs as though the tomb itself were breathing into me. The deeper they went, the more unbearable it became. Men fainted, their tongues dry as bone. Those who staggered back to the surface reported their skin peeling as though sun-scorched, though they had been underground. And then came the screams. Dane wrote of voices echoing through the chamber, voices that did not belong to his men. They were neither prayers nor cries of pain. They were chants, spoken in a rhythm that throbbed like the beating of a heart. When they reached the sarcophagus, they found it glowing faintly red as if embers pulsed within. The chains around it hissed, dripping molten iron onto the floor. One man dared to touch the lid with the tip of his pickaxe. The tool burst into flames. Dane fled that night, leaving the tomb half open, but no record exists of what became of the others who followed him inside. Some say they burned alive. Others insist they were consumed not by fire but by something that wore the shape of it. The villagers who lived near the excavation site later filled the shaft with stone, pouring sand until the desert swallowed it whole once more. They warn even now that on certain nights, when the wind is hot and still, you can hear a crackling beneath the dunes, not like firewood but like bones splintering. Some claim to see faint light rising from the sand, not flame, but a glow that paints the desert red for just a moment before vanishing. Who, or what, was buried there? Some scholars whisper it was not a king at all, but a priest who had stolen fire from the gods, binding it into his own flesh. Others believe he was the vessel of a spirit older than the city itself, something that fed not on wood or oil but on human souls. Perhaps that is why his tomb burns without flame, because what smolders within is not fire, but hunger. And if that hunger were ever unchained, what would it devour first? The sands, the cities, or the sky itself? The tomb remains sealed, swallowed by the desert, but the heat never fades. It waits beneath the shifting dunes, a furnace without smoke, a hunger without end. And perhaps the most haunting question of all, how long can stone and sand contain something that burns not with fire, but with will? They called him the Cradle King, a child monarch crowned before his bones had hardened, worshipped as a living deity, buried before he ever spoke a full sentence. His tomb, hidden beneath the windswept cliffs of an unnamed desert, was not simply sealed, it was swaddled in silence. No inscription announced his name. No statue bore his likeness. Only a single stone cradle, carved into the entrance arch, hinted at the life entombed within. Why would an entire kingdom erase the memory of its own god-king? And more disturbingly, why did they chain his burial chamber shut from the outside? The first explorers who stumbled upon the site in the early 1900s wrote in fractured journals, half-burnt and water-stained. They described a staircase carved into the sandstone, descending in a perfect spiral. At every fifth step, an iron ring jutted from the wall as though something, or someone, had once been bound there. The air was dry, yet thick with the scent of milkweed and ash. Torches sputtered for no reason. Compasses spun at the bottom. They reached a round chamber lined with bas-reliefs. The carvings depicted a crowned infant being worshipped by kneeling priests. But as the panels progressed, the scenes changed. The child grew wings of bone. The priests began to cover their eyes. One carved scene showed the people dragging a crib, not a coffin, into the desert while the sun bled black. And there, in the center of the chamber, was the tomb, a massive stone cradle chained shut with 7 interlocking locks, each etched with a symbol that scholars have never successfully translated. Some claim they resemble early Proto-Sumerian glyphs. Others say they look like spinal vertebrae. One archaeologist reportedly said, "It is a language meant to be unread." The team attempted to open one lock. Within 24 hours, every member of that expedition vanished. Their tents remained. Their food was untouched. A single note was found, scrawled into the sand near the tomb entrance. "He's still dreaming." Since then, the site has been declared off-limits by the regional government. No official reason given. Satellite imagery shows the entire valley has been covered with imported sand and planted with fast-growing thorn shrubs, effectively erasing its location. Yet nomadic tribes in the area still tell the same bedtime warning, "Never wake the Cradle King or all sons will dream in his place." Is the tomb truly a burial chamber, or a prison for something that was never meant to grow? Was the infant king divine, or a mistake the ancient world tried to bury alive? And the real question that lingers like smoke, if he was only a child, why did they build 7 locks? She was known only as the Breathless Queen, a ruler who, according to fractured chronicles, never exhaled in her life. The scribes wrote that her chest rose but never fell, that her lips were forever sealed, and that she spoke only in whispers that made entire courts tremble. Some say she was not born but summoned, carved out of stone and given the illusion of flesh. Others insist she was cursed at birth, Doomed to rule without breath, without sleep, without end, her tomb rests beneath a blackened plateau in Eastern Europe, a place locals avoid even at midday. The earth there swallows sound. Birds refuse to fly overhead, and travelers report that even their own breathing becomes shallow, as if the air itself is stolen away. In 1846, a team of miners accidentally broke into the edge of the tomb while searching for copper veins. What they described has never left the archives of a single monastery, hidden away, copied in fragments, whispered about only in dark corners. They claimed to find a massive stone door carved with lungs that were inverted, carved inside out, rib cage curling toward the sky. Chains wrapped across it, but unlike ordinary restraints, these chains seemed to be forged from calcified bone, not iron. When struck, they rang not like metal but like hollow throats. Behind the door, the miners described a stairwell descending into a suffocating chamber. Every step they took left them more breathless, as though something was draining the oxygen itself. The walls were covered with carvings of the queen, always with her mouth shut, her eyes open, her attendants falling dead at her feet as though strangled by invisible hands. In the deepest chamber they found her sarcophagus, made not of stone, but of glass so dark it absorbed their lantern light. And then they saw it. The figure inside the glass was not mummified nor skeletal. It was whole, her skin pale as ivory, her lips still sealed. The men swore they could see her chest rising, slowly, methodically, like the ticking of some eternal clock. One of the miners pressed his ear to the glass. He claimed he heard a low hum, a sound not unlike the hollow moan of a dying wind. Within minutes, his own breath began to stutter, his face turning blue, until the others dragged him away. He survived, but he never inhaled deeply again. For the rest of his life, he spoke in short bursts, as if something inside him refused to let his lungs expand. The miners sealed the chamber in terror, piling rocks until the black plateau looked untouched. But their silence could not protect them. Within a year, each of them died in their sleep. Lungs collapsed, bodies untouched. Locals who heard of the discovery whispered that the queen had claimed them as her own, feeding off the breath they dared to steal from her tomb. Since then, no government has attempted excavation. Maps erased the plateau's coordinates. Yet nomads still mutter about a shadowed figure that walks the desert on moonless nights, carrying no torch, making no sound. Those who glimpse her swear the air around her is heavy, unmovable, as though she carries her tomb with her, strangling the world one breath at a time. But questions remain. Why would a civilization bury a queen who still breathed within her coffin? Why was she encased in glass rather than stone? Was it to honor her, or to ensure she could be watched? And most chilling of all, if she never breathed in life, then what is it exactly that rises and falls within her chest? Because if the breathless queen is not sleeping, if she is only waiting, then each breath we take may be counted against her silence. And the moment she exhales for the first time, what else will stop breathing with her? They called it La Crypta Sangrante, the crying tomb. Deep in the hills of southern Spain, hidden beneath crumbling olive groves and cracked limestone, stands a burial chamber sealed so tightly that even earthquakes have not broken it. But the seal does not hide its presence. For centuries, villagers have spoken of red streaks leaking from the stone door, staining the earth like veins. They swear the tomb weeps, and the liquid it sheds is not water but blood. The first written account comes from a monk in the late 1500s. He was sent to investigate rumors that a church cemetery nearby was losing its dead. Graves left open, coffins split apart, bodies missing. His journal, now locked in a private collection, describes how he followed the trail of disturbed soil into the hills until he found a massive stone arch buried in the earth. It was sealed with mortar as hard as iron, and across its surface ran thin streams of red liquid that smelled of copper. The monk believed it was a natural mineral deposit, until he pressed his hand against the stone. The red stain was warm, sticky, and unmistakably organic. His notes claimed that when he tasted a drop, hesitantly, fearfully, he felt his body convulse, his heart beating so violently he collapsed. When he awoke, he swore he heard faint screams behind the stone, as though the dead inside the tomb were still crying to be released. The tomb was left untouched for centuries, but local shepherds said animals avoided it. Sheep refused to graze nearby. Dogs howled in terror when brought close. In 1799, during the Napoleonic Wars, soldiers seeking refuge stumbled upon the chamber. They tried breaking open the seal with cannon fire. Villagers say only one man survived, and he was found days later in the mountains, his mouth filled with blood, muttering the same phrase again and again, "They're still alive in there. They're still alive." The legend grew darker with every retelling. Some whispered that the tomb belonged to a cult of priests who performed rituals to keep their bodies from decaying. Others believed it held the remains of children offered as sacrifices to an unknown deity. And then came the most disturbing rumor of all, that the blood that seeps from the door is not from the tomb, but from those who dare to go near it. That somehow the tomb drinks the life of trespassers, bleeding them slowly until they vanish into the walls. Modern archaeologists attempted to dismiss these tales as folklore, yet in 1963 a research team secretly drilled into the outer wall. Within hours, every member of the team became violently ill, coughing up blood. Their instruments, retrieved weeks later, were corroded with a red film that laboratory analysis failed to identify. The samples were destroyed, sealed away in classified archives. And so the tomb remains sealed to this day. But the ground still bleeds. Farmers who work near the hills wake to find their wells stained red, their crops spotted as if by rain, but no clouds hang in the sky. Pilgrims sometimes leave offerings at the stone door. Candles, flowers, even coins. They say the tomb cries less when it is fed, as though it hungers for gifts, or for flesh. Yet the most haunting part of the tale lies in a warning carved by an unknown hand on the rock above the entrance. If the door opens, the world will drown in what it has denied. A chilling riddle, for no one knows what it means. Is the tomb filled with the blood of its occupants, waiting to spill into the world? Or is the blood itself alive, a punishment for disturbing those who were never meant to rest? One thing is certain. Those who stand before the crying tomb never forget it. They say the stone door breathes, pulsing faintly like a vein beneath the skin. And if you stay long enough, you will hear not just weeping, but knocking, steady and patient, as if the sealed dead are still begging to be let out. And the question remains, if the tomb is truly weeping blood, what will it do when it finally learns how to scream? There is a tomb in the desert sands of Egypt, one that is whispered about even among those who dedicate their lives to studying ancient ruins. It does not appear on official excavation maps, nor is it marked on public records. Locals know it only as the Chamber of Silence, for no birds sing above it, no insects crawl upon its stones, and the desert winds fall mute when they pass over its entrance. The chamber was first uncovered in 1922, not long after the sensational discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. A British expedition, eager to claim glory of their own, followed cryptic references from fragmented papyrus scrolls that hinted at a burial unlike any other. They believed it to be the final resting place of a forgotten pharaoh, a ruler whose name was deliberately erased from every stele, every temple, every record. A king erased not because he was weak, but because he was dangerous. When the team unearthed the sealed stone stairway, they expected riches. Instead, they found something far more disturbing. The walls were lined with hieroglyphs not of gods welcoming the dead, but of chained figures bowing before a massive black sun. Strange symbols, unlike any recorded in Egyptian history, spiraled across the sandstone in patterns that some swore resembled constellations. Others swore looked like eyes that at the bottom lay the sealed chamber door. Across it were painted warnings in red ochre. He who opens this chamber will unchain the hunger that devours both flesh and soul. Most brushed it off as superstition. One man, however, the expedition's translator, pleaded for them to stop. He claimed the writing did not simply warn of a curse. It named the being entombed within not as a pharaoh, but as a sorcerer king, who had bargained with something darker than the gods. Ignoring his cries, the team forced open the seal. What they found inside was no golden sarcophagus, but a black basalt coffin chained to the floor by iron rings fused into the rock. Around it were hundreds of jars, not canopic jars but tall urns filled with ash, sealed with wax. The translator grew pale when he read their inscriptions. To bind the voices. To silence the dead. One by one, members of the expedition began to die. The first choked to death in his sleep, his face contorted as though unseen hands were wrapped around his throat. Another was found with every bone shattered, though his skin bore no bruise. The leader of the dig simply vanished, his tent found empty, his footprints ending in the sand just a few feet away from the chamber's entrance, as if something had plucked him from the earth. Within a year, every man who entered that tomb was dead or missing. The Egyptian authorities resealed the chamber, ordering it buried beneath tons of stone. They declared it too unstable to be preserved, a convenient excuse to hide what had happened. But the workers who laid the stones claimed they heard chanting from within, low and guttural, in a language none recognized. Some quit on the spot. Others fled the desert forever. To this day, the tomb has never been reopened. Satellite images show an unnatural smoothness where the sands cover its ruins, as if something beneath keeps the dunes pressed flat. Local Bedouins refuse to pass through the area, insisting the ground hums at night, vibrating like a heartbeat. What makes this chamber truly terrifying, however, is the rumor passed down by those who still guard the oral history of forgotten dynasties, that the pharaoh entombed there was not buried alive but buried awake, and that the chains, the ash, and the silence were not meant to honor him, but to keep him from calling out. The question that chills historians and thrill-seekers alike is simple. If this so-called sorcerer king has remained imprisoned for over 3,000 years, what happens if the chains finally rust away? What happens if the silence breaks and the hunger buried beneath the sands of Egypt is allowed to rise once more? Perhaps that is why the desert above his tomb remains so still. Perhaps it listens just as the world waits. Because sometimes silence is not peace. Sometimes it is the sound of something waiting for permission to speak. And when it does, the earth itself may wish the tomb had stayed forever sealed. In the quiet highlands of Eastern Europe, where the forests stretch unbroken and the mist clings to the valleys, there lies a lake that villagers call the Drowned Mirror. Its waters are unnaturally still, its surface rarely disturbed even by wind. Fishermen refuse to cast their nets there, claiming that no fish swim beneath the surface. But the true reason is older, whispered only in candlelight. Beneath those waters lies a tomb so cursed that it was entombed not with stone, but with the lake itself. The story begins in the 14th century, during a plague that devoured entire villages. A warlord, known only as the Black Count, ruled the region with cruelty unmatched. Unlike others, his land seemed untouched by the plague, and rumors spread that he had bargained with something inhuman. His soldiers captured children from neighboring towns, and none were ever seen again. Survivors claimed the Count performed midnight rituals in a cathedral stripped of its crosses, offering blood to an idol carved from blackened wood. When the peasants finally rose against him, they stormed his castle only to find every hall empty, every soldier gone. In the great hall, they found the Count sitting upon his throne, smiling, his skin pale as chalk, his eyes reflecting torchlight like a beast's. He did not resist as they bound him in chains and dragged him to the stone crypt beneath the castle. There, priests from across the land carved wards into the walls, sealing him inside a coffin wrapped in lead and iron. But the castle did not stand long. Within days, the villagers reported screams rising from beneath their feet, screams that no stone could contain. They fled, abandoning the fortress, while priests and masons worked feverishly. Their solution was not to bury the crypt deeper, but to erase it entirely. They diverted rivers, collapsed the valley, and let the waters consume the ruins. By the time their work was done, the tomb lay hidden beneath a lake so deep no sunlight touched its bottom. Centuries passed and the Black Count became legend. Yet strange things never ceased. Travelers reported seeing pale hands breaking the surface of the water before vanishing without a ripple. Entire flocks of birds refused to fly over the lake, circling wide as though the air above it was poisoned. Locals said that at night, you could hear faint knocking echoing up from beneath the waters, like iron chains being dragged across stone. In 1928, a team of divers attempted to explore the ruins with crude equipment. Only 2 returned. The survivor, half mad, claimed that beneath the lake was not a crypt but a city of stone, carved with spirals and faces that wept black water. At its center stood a coffin bound by massive chains, larger than any human could have forged. He swore he saw it moving, rocking gently as though something within still breathed. His final words to reporters before being committed were simple: "The water keeps it calm. If the lake ever dries, he will walk again." Scientists dismissed his claims, but the villagers never forgot. To this day they pour offerings of salt and blood into the water each spring, muttering prayers to keep the Black Count bound. In recent years, however, climate change has begun to shrink the lake. On hot summers, parts of the ruins break the surface, stone arches jutting out like skeletal ribs. What if the villagers were right? What if the water was not meant to bury the tomb, but to drown it, to press it down into silence? And what happens when the silence is broken, when chains rust, when the lake grows shallow enough for the coffin to rise? The villagers warn travelers with a single phrase, passed down through generations: never let the water fall. Because if it does, the Black Count's tomb will no longer remain sealed beneath the lake. It will walk again, dripping, hungry, and searching for the children his rituals once devoured. Would you dare stand at its shore and listen for the sound of knocking beneath the water? Or worse, would you dare answer? In the barren hills of southern Spain, hidden among ridges where no maps dare mark, lies a monastery long abandoned. Its walls are cracked, its bells rusted silent, and its cloisters overrun with ivy. The villagers call it El Convento de los Silencios, the convent of silence. No prayers rise there, no hymns are sung, yet deep beneath its stones rests a tomb so feared that even the devout refuse to cross its threshold. They say the silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something listening. Centuries ago, the monastery was home to a choir renowned across Christendom. Their voices were said to carry unearthly harmony, moving even the hardest hearts to tears. But as their fame grew, so did whispers. Their chants were not sacred hymns but invocations. The brothers sang not to heaven but to something beneath the earth. Travelers who stayed overnight reported hearing music at midnight, melodies so haunting they lingered for days in the mind, driving some to madness. Then came the night of the final. Massachusetts records are scarce, but fragments remain, scribbled by a scribe who fled. The choir gathered not in the chapel but in the crypt below, where an altar of black stone waited. They sang until the walls shook. Witnesses described voices layering one over another until they no longer sounded human. The monks' mouths moved, but the voices came from everywhere, behind, above, even from within the listener's own chest. When villagers entered the monastery the next morning, they found every monk dead, their faces frozen mid-song. The walls of the crypt dripped with condensation though no water was near. In the center lay a sealed stone chamber carved with countless mouths. The chamber had no hinges, no handles, only a single inscription: "Let silence hold them lest the song return." The chamber was sealed. The monastery was abandoned. Yet the story did not end there. For centuries, locals reported strange phenomena. Travelers passing the ruins claimed to hear choirs in the distance, though the walls stood empty. Shepherds swore their flocks froze in place, ears twitching, as though hearing music no human could detect. And on certain nights, when the moonlight struck the chapel just right, faint whispers echoed from beneath the earth. In 1893, a group of archaeologists excavated the monastery, seeking the crypt. What they found was more terrifying than legend. The tomb walls were carved with faces, hundreds, their mouths open wide in perpetual song. When their lanterns flickered, shadows danced across the carvings, and some swore the mouths moved. The archaeologists reported the air vibrating like a low note sustained, though none of them had spoken. Their journals mention one discovery before they abandoned the site: a small hole in the tomb's wall from which a faint sound drifted, like distant singing carried through stone. No excavation has been attempted since. Priests who visited in the early 20th century warned the government that the tomb must remain sealed, that the choir's voices were not mortal but a possession, spirits bound into eternal song, waiting for listeners to join their chorus. Today the monastery is forbidden ground. Locals hang charms of iron and salt at the nearest road. Tourists who dare approach often return shaken, claiming their phones record faint chanting though they heard nothing with their ears. Some say if you stand too long in the cloister, you begin to hum without realizing, as if the song has slipped past your lips from somewhere deep inside. But the greatest fear is not the song itself, it is what the song summons. Old texts suggest the monks were not worshippers, but vessels, binding something vast and ancient beneath the earth with their voices. Their choir was not performance, it was prison. And when their voices stopped, silence was forced upon them, sealed forever in stone. So the question remains: what happens if that silence is broken? If the tomb beneath the convent is opened, will the choir's song resume, and with it, the return of whatever they kept bound? Perhaps that is why the inscription endures, worn but unbroken, as if etched by hands desperate for us to obey: "Let silence hold them." Would you dare descend into that crypt, to place your ear against its stone, and hear whether the song has truly ended? Or worse, discover that it never stopped, and that the silent choir has been waiting patiently for someone to join in? Among the countless tombs scattered across the Valley of the Kings, one remains spoken of only in whispers by archaeologists and locals alike. It is not marked on tourist maps. No guidebook mentions it. Official records list it as an unfinished chamber. Yet beneath the sand, behind walls that no one dares breach, lies the final resting place of a pharaoh whose very name was erased from stone. Nebkar-Setepenra, the king historians call the pharaoh who refused the sun. Unlike other rulers who aligned themselves with the solar god Ra, Nebkar turned his back on the heavens. In fragments of forbidden hymns discovered in crumbling papyri, he spoke not of the sun's life-giving light, but of shadows as eternal protectors. He believed that Ra's promise of rebirth was a deception, that true immortality came not from basking in light, but from sinking into darkness. Priests of the time denounced him, and scribes were ordered to chisel his name from monuments. Yet before his erasure, Nebkar had already prepared something unthinkable: a tomb designed not for rest but for concealment. Unlike the grand corridors of other pharaohs, his burial site was carved to swallow light itself. Torches brought inside extinguished themselves as if the walls breathed in flame. Explorers who entered centuries later reported that even the brightest lamps could not reach more than a few feet, as though shadows thickened with each step. One account, written by a 17th-century grave robber who somehow escaped, describes hieroglyphs carved in reverse, as if meant to be read only by eyes and used to light. He claimed the final chamber contained no sarcophagus, only a black pit, lined with obsidian, and a single warning etched across the stone: "He shall not rise with the dawn. Disturb not his night." The story might have remained a legend, but in the 1920s, a team of Egyptologists rediscovered the sealed passage. They tried to open the tomb, but every worker hired to assist refused after the first night. Local men reported nightmares of black suns and voices that chanted in forgotten tongues. Tools vanished. Lamps shattered. Finally, one British archaeologist forced entry with dynamite. His notes, later found in Cairo, describe a silence thicker than death, a pressure in the air that seemed to grind thought into dust. He wrote that the deeper he went, the more his body weakened, as if the tomb itself drank his strength. His journal ends abruptly with a final line: "The pit is not empty." His body was never recovered. Since then, authorities have denied the tomb's existence. Military patrols keep the valley clear of anyone who strays too close to its rumored entrance. Yet every few years a story surfaces: a tourist wandering too far and returning pale, lips cracked, whispering in a voice not their own about shadows beneath the sun. Some Egyptologists speculate that Nebkar had created a ritual to trap himself between life and death. Unlike other pharaohs who sought eternal rebirth, he wanted eternal stillness, a defiance of the natural cycle. To open his tomb would not simply disturb a resting king, it might unbind a force that thrives in absence, the hunger of darkness itself. What unnerves scholars most is that across Egypt, no other burial inscription speaks directly to the living. Pharaohs commanded worship, offerings, or remembrance. But Nebkar's tomb begs, almost desperately, "Disturb not his night." It is less a curse, more a plea, one that suggests even those who buried him feared what he had become. And so the tomb remains sealed. Sand covers its entrance, stone blocks bind its doors, and silence guards its corridors. But silence is fragile. A single step, a single crack of light admitted into that pit, could be enough to awaken what has been sleeping since the age of the pyramids. Would you dare bring a torch into a chamber that swallows flame? Would you lean over a pit meant to house not a body but a presence? Or would you, like those who came before, obey the words etched in desperate stone: "Never open, never look, never let the pharaoh who refused the sun rise again"? Because perhaps he still waits, not in the world of the dead, nor the world of the living, but in the endless eclipse between. High in the Caucasus Mountains, hidden by snow for half the year, stands a monastery spoken of only in fragments of folklore and forbidden church manuscripts. Known locally as Zvelim Skoveli, the place where the saints sleep, it was once a thriving center of worship during the 9th century. Today it is nothing but ruins, sealed chambers, and a silence that feels intentional. Travelers who stumble upon its broken walls often report a strange detail: heavy iron locks bolted into doors that lead into the ground, their keys long since lost. What secrets lay beneath, and why would holy men of God seal them so tightly? The official church record claims that the underground chambers were catacombs, designed to house relics of martyrs. Yet the villagers living nearest to the mountain tell a darker story. They speak of locked saints, monks who practiced forbidden rites and sought immortality not through prayer, but through binding their own souls to their bodies. Instead of allowing death to carry them into heaven, these monks performed rituals meant to chain their spirits to their bones, believing eternal vigilance would make them closer to God. But something went terribly wrong. Legends claim that when the monks attempted their ritual, the monastery was filled with screams so inhuman that shepherds miles away abandoned their flocks. By dawn, the mountain itself seemed to quake. Those brave enough to enter later reported that the monks had not died, but neither were they alive. Their flesh remained pale and stretched, their eyes open but clouded. They did not speak, but their lips moved endlessly in silent prayer. The abbot, horrified at what they had become, ordered the chambers sealed. Heavy chains and locks were hammered into stone, and guards were sworn to keep them sealed forever. Centuries later, crusaders on their march east recorded finding the monastery. One night, Sir Alaric of Mainz left behind a journal describing his curiosity about the locked saints. He and a small group broke into one of the sealed chambers. He wrote of rows of monks seated against the walls, unmoving, their robes intact though centuries had passed. When one knight dared to touch a monk's shoulder, the figure's head turned slowly toward him, lips moving in that same silent prayer. The knight fell to the ground moments later, his eyes rolled white. Sir Alaric's account ends with one chilling note: the locks were mercy, not chains. In the centuries since, the monastery has remained a place of fear. Locals avoid it even when hunting or traveling through the mountains. Shepherds swear their animals refuse to graze within sight of its towers. On winter nights, travelers claim to hear the faint rhythm of chanting echoing from the earth beneath the ruins, low voices humming in a tongue no one now recognizes. What is most disturbing is that the iron locks, though ancient, still hold firm. Historians who have examined them note they were crafted with unusual skill, as though their makers intended them to resist not only time but tampering. Unlike other medieval locks, these are fused with the stone itself, as if the very walls were shaped to trap whatever lay within. Some modern scholars dismiss the locked saints as myth, suggesting the monks simply died in their underground cells during a plague or famine. But if that were true, why seal the doors with iron and chain? Why preserve the site in secret manuscripts that warn explicitly, "Pray outside, never within"? There are whispers in theological circles that the monastery may have been hiding something more than failed monks, perhaps an early Christian sect that dabbled in necromancy, blending scripture with pagan resurrection rituals. If so, then what lies behind those iron doors may not be monks at all, but something created in defiance of both life and death. The monastery still stands, battered by storms but unmoved by time. Its doors remain locked, its chains unbroken. And yet, how long can iron hold against eternity? How long before curiosity pries open what faith once sealed? Imagine walking through the crumbling halls, torchlight bouncing across broken icons, the scent of ancient incense still clinging to the stone. Ahead you find one of the locked doors, iron, rusted but intact. You hear nothing. But if you pressed your ear against the cold metal, perhaps you would hear it. A whisper, a chant, or maybe only the sound of lips still moving in endless prayer, waiting for the moment someone dares turn the key that no longer exists. Would you open the door? Or would you flee, leaving the monks of the locked saints sealed in the half-life they chose, and the world spared from whatever prayer they have been whispering to the dark for more than 1,000 years? Not all tombs carry legends of gold or treasures. Some whisper of a far darker inheritance. Curses that do not sleep, guardians that are not flesh, and doors that were never meant to be forced open. Among the most feared is the tale of the tomb that should never be disturbed, a burial sealed so absolutely that even the most relentless grave robbers refused to touch it. Hidden deep in a barren desert canyon, its location was almost erased from maps, as though the earth itself wanted to bury the knowledge along with the body entombed inside. When first discovered by wandering explorers, the entrance was unlike any other. A colossal slab of stone pressed into the earth, chained and reinforced with what looked like melted iron, as though fire itself had been used to weld it shut. Symbols burned into the stone warned of punishment beyond death. Not hieroglyphs, not Latin, but something older, script carved in a language no scholar could translate. Those who attempted to sketch the symbols described a strange unease, as if the carvings were shifting when they looked away. Stories say the person buried there was not a king, not a prophet, but a figure so reviled that no empire dared speak his name. Some whispered he was a priest who betrayed his gods, unleashing rituals that consumed whole villages. Others claimed he was a ruler who sought immortality by feeding off the souls of his people. Whatever the truth, the sentence was clear. His tomb would never be opened, not in this life or the next. But men are curious, and forbidden doors always call to those who dream of fame. In the late 1800s, a team of archaeologists believed they had located the tomb after deciphering fragments of a forgotten manuscript. They attempted to pry apart the iron chains, only to find their tools shattered. Not days later, strange phenomena plagued their camp. Tents collapsing in the dead of night, animals refusing to enter the canyon, and men waking with deep scratches across their arms and faces as if clawed in their sleep. One night, the lead archaeologist was found wandering half a mile from the tomb, mumbling a single phrase in a language none could understand. His eyes were wide open, but he was blind. He never recovered. The project was abandoned, the tomb resealed, the site struck from their records. What lies beyond that sealed stone? Why was such extreme effort made to erase this man, or this thing, from human memory? Was it simply fear of evil deeds, or something darker that the ancients knew we would never comprehend? Every attempt to return has ended in silence. The canyon itself seems to swallow trespassers whole. Storms gather unnaturally, compasses fail, and those who make it close enough swear they hear a low hum from behind the chained door, like a heartbeat pulsing through stone. Could something still live within? Could something still be waiting? The chilling thought remains. Perhaps this tomb was not meant to imprison the dead but to contain the living. And if the seal were ever broken, whether by greed, arrogance, or accident, what exactly would crawl back into the world? So we are left with the warning etched into its face, words scholars still cannot translate, but whose meaning everyone understands: never open. From the sands of Egypt to the frozen mountains of Siberia, from hidden catacombs beneath Europe to deserts that swallow entire cities, one truth has echoed across civilizations. Some doors were never meant to be opened. That we've traveled through the myths and the warnings, the curses and the strange phenomena surrounding these forbidden tombs. Each one sealed not merely to honor the dead, but to protect the living. Kings feared thieves. Priests feared betrayal. Villages feared demons. And yet, through every story, a single thread runs deeper than gold or power. It is the fear of something awakening if the stones are disturbed. Think about it. Why would ancient builders go to such extremes? Walls thicker than fortresses, doors welded with fire, tombs hidden in landscapes meant to erase them from memory. Why the chains, the curses, the threats carved in languages so old that even today's scholars cannot untangle them? Were these merely superstitions, or warnings we've been arrogant enough to ignore? History has shown us what happens when curiosity turns reckless. The men who broke into sealed chambers often found themselves swallowed by mysterious illnesses, plagued by visions, or disappearing without explanation. Camps abandoned. Journals cut short mid-sentence. Expeditions that never returned. These patterns repeat across centuries, across continents. Coincidence or consequence? The question that lingers is perhaps the most terrifying of all. What if these tombs were never tombs at all? What if they were prisons? Not resting places for the dead, but cages for something that should never walk among the living again. If so, every crack we carve into their stone, every chain we break, is not an act of discovery, but of release. And the truth is, humanity never learns. Even now, with satellites scanning deserts, sonar mapping caves, and machines capable of drilling into places untouched for millennia, the temptation grows stronger. Archaeologists seek prestige, Adventurers seek treasure, governments seek power. And somewhere out there, beneath miles of rock, behind walls engraved with never open, something waits. But maybe the ancients were not only warning us. Maybe they were begging us. Begging the future not to repeat the mistakes that once demanded such drastic measures. So I leave you with one final question. If you stood before one of these sealed tombs tonight, chains rusting, stone cracked just enough for a whisper to seep through, would you step closer? Would you listen? Or would you turn away knowing that some knowledge, once uncovered, cannot be buried again? Because history is not just written in books, it is sealed in stone. And when stone breaks, when doors give way, the past does not always stay dead. Forbidden tombs that were sealed forever. Some remain hidden. Some are waiting. And some are daring us to ignore their final warning. Never open.